In our everyday lives, we have a series of interruptions, things that break into our everyday routine. And we can react many different ways to them. We can be annoyed. If we're really busy trying to get something done, trying to finish that last email, busy trying to get our preparations all set, and somebody interrupts us, we could be annoyed. We're so focused on what we want to have, or what we're doing and what we want to get done. But on the other hand, if we're going about our day and then a good friend that we haven't heard from in months calls us, interrupts our routine, that's something we receive in a very positive way, isn't it? The season of Advent can be described as that, described as interruption. God is breaking into our lives. In fact, as we begin this celebration today, we see that the routine that we've had over the past few months, that of the liturgical color of green, is changed to purple. The tone of the music is different. The whole feel of Advent feels different. It's an interruption into our routine that we've been used to. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Jesus is speaking about just that. He's speaking about when God will break into our lives, into our everyday routine. Talking about it in very dramatic terms, albeit, but nevertheless in the ordinariness of everyday life. When people were out grinding their wheat, when people were celebrating their marriages, in everyday life, what God would break in. And I think for us to understand is to see how is that for us. Is that interruption? Is that waking up and having that coffee that wakes us up, rather? Is that something that we receive as a gift of grace? Or is it something that we'd rather push away? Because Jesus gives us a warning. He says, in the times of Noah, when the world was about to be destroyed, people didn't heed the warnings. They were sleepwalking. They didn't want to listen to Noah. They didn't want to change their routines. And God, through Noah, was trying to say, wake up, pay attention. St. Paul is giving us that same message. St. Paul, who had his life completely and utterly interrupted by the Lord, changed when he met the Lord, the risen Christ, on the road to Damascus. From that point on, everything that he thought he knew to be true, the way in which he was living his life, changed completely because of that encounter with the risen Lord. Now for him, he didn't have to wake up. That divine intervention, so to speak, was that experience that woke him up. But I believe for most of us, most of the time, we get into this routine. We get into the routine of all the things that we have, the plans that we have established, the things that we want to do, all the things that we want to accomplish. And oftentimes, we're sleepwalking. We're not paying attention to the different ways that God wants to break in. God's grace wants to break into our lives. And part of that can be is that we just don't know. As Jesus is saying, we do not know the time. We do not know the hour. And because of that, because we don't know, there's things in our lives we don't like that uncertainty. So instead of struggling with that, we just kind of maybe put it on the back burner. We don't think about it. And we deal with those things that we can control. But when it comes to the coming of Christ into our lives, we cannot control that. We cannot control grace. We cannot control the gifts that God wants to give us. But what we're called to do is to prepare ourselves to be open, to prepare ourselves to be awake, to prepare ourselves to receive those gifts of God's love and salvation to us. St. Paul is saying that our salvation is closer than when we began. I think too often our world thinks that it's just kind of cyclical. We go through the same old routine. Our lives are not going anywhere. But that's not true with God working in our lives. We come once again to Advent, but God has a gift of salvation to give to us. God wants to build on the grace that we've already received throughout this past year. And God wants to give his grace to us in new ways. That we know. We know that Christ's coming is good news. We don't know when, but it is good news. Christ wishes to come to us with that fuller gift of joy, that fuller gift of peace, that fuller gift of knowing that we are embraced by that love. But yet, there's that other side of the coin, as St. Paul talks about. There's something that we need to let go of. He says, take off that darkness. Take off that clothing of our sinfulness, of the routines that lead us or maybe keep us into sin, our old ways of thinking, our old ways of acting, those old habits that kind of protect us in a certain sense from God's grace of breaking in and making us new. Put on the armor of Christ. Put on that armor of light. And how do we do that? We do that first, again, by waking up, by opening our eyes, preparing ourselves. Perhaps it's looking within our everyday lives and taking time to reflect. Where was God working? What was the gift of God's grace that he gave me, gave you today? Do we take time to even realize that? I believe that's one of the most powerful ways that we can open our eyes, is when we take time to reflect where God's hand has been in our lives. Because when we go from one experience to another experience, when we go from one accomplishment to another, we're looking at ourselves, our doing, rather than God's hand being in our lives, his love operating in our lives. And that's always found in prayer. Taking time to be silent, taking time to listen. Advent is a time to do that. Preparing our hearts through prayer, through reflection, to wake up. But then finally, what we need to do is do things in our everyday lives. How do we change our thinking, our acting? How do we let go of those things that keep us from recognizing the presence of Christ? Isaiah speaks about that in terms of preparing for peace. Taking all of our preparations that we use to keep conflicts going, our reactions that are violent, that are bound in judgment, in hatred, in animosity, in division. Instead of preparing our hearts for that or just acting automatically in that way, how do we prepare ourselves for peace? How do we prepare ourselves to forgive one another? Looking at those conflicts that exist within our relationships. If we are to make peace, it's work. It takes effort. It takes prayer, and it makes our willingness to do something different. Season of Advent is a season of waking up. But it's also a season of preparation, preparing our minds, our hearts, our souls to live differently. It's a season of preparing our hearts, our lives, to allow Christ to come and recognizing him when he does come.